Hello. I said I'd stream this weekend, and it is still this weekend, at least in my time zone. And it will be for another 3 hours. Maybe don't dox yourself, Clay. Anyway, hi. I said I would stream this weekend, and I'm holding up to it. So we're going to be reading chapter 4 of Through a Glass Divine. I've been really enjoying reading this one. Like, I always enjoy reading Bones and the Bees' work because Bones and the Bees is just amazing at what she does. Amazing writer. I just realized, with, like, the QSMP egg stuff, you think there's ever going to be, like, fanfics written with SBI plus, like, eggs or something? Like the eggs, like Cheyenne and Tallulah? That would be really cool. I would read the shit out of that. My day's been pretty good. I didn't really do much. I ate. I did homework. I watched Phil and Wilbur and Rombu, who played Minecraft. Yeah, that's about it. I didn't really do much today. Let's read this, shall we? Oh, something else has been happening lately. Since I last went live, I decided to film some silly little TikToks, and one of them blew up. One of them is on track to becoming my most viewed and liked video. It's still not going to be for another 20,000 likes, but I don't want to check on it now. A lot of the things that go viral for me are stuff to do with autism. Is that what I should do now? Talk about how I am autistic. I mean, the autistic tag is in my stream. Like, is in my profile every time I go live. But I'm not really that articulate. I'm not really good at voicing my thoughts. I tried doing that for a bit in 2020, and I look back on the things that I said, like the way that I say them, not the things I actually said, but like the way I said them, and I cringe. Alright. Let's read this next chapter, right? Chapter 4. Oh wait, first off, in case you're new to me doing these reading things, what I do is, like, I probably will expand to other authors, but right now I've been reading only Bones and the Bees because she's one of the only reliable ones that I know. Like, it's hard for me to find fanfics that aren't NSFW or, I mean, I guess it wouldn't be that hard if I actually looked for them. I'm just worried that I will stumble upon a fanfic, think that it's okay, because I go into these blind. Maybe what would help is me reading the tags. I think that'll be a good idea. Alright. Let's do it, eh? Chapter 4. A Cage Less Gilded. Summary. The Pythia grows bored. The Pythia thought it would be difficult to pass the time in the Death Temple. He was wrong. Days passed. He and Tommy fell into a routine of sorts. It would begin with Tommy knocking on their shared door in the morning, giving him only a few minutes to tug his blindfold around his face before the boy came barging in with far too much energy for the early hour. Then, he'd drag the Pythia to get breakfast. Sometimes they'd sit with Tubbo, Rambu, and Amesy, but most of the time Tommy got their food to go. The Pythia preferred this, and he was sure Tommy could tell. Nikki's makeshift tattoo parlor was a place of refuge to the Pythia. Even though he rarely made conversation with her, Nikki was far easier to be around than the other deathlings like Tubbo. And she never pushed him to talk, which he was grateful for. Most of the time, she'd just chat with Tommy or focus on designing runes or tattoos in her sketchbook, while Tommy rambled about whatever random subject was at the forefront of his thoughts that day. The Pythia, for the most part, would stay silent. He'd tear bread rolls apart with his fingers, trying to seem disinterested in whatever it was Tommy was going on about this time. Eventually, they'd leave Nikki be. From there, things got difficult. Because even if he was in charge of their only prisoner, all the deathlings had responsibilities in the temple, and Tommy couldn't get out of those. The Pythia would sit off to the side, watching Tommy scrub dishes, wash clothes, beat the dust off of rugs, or even mend clothes with a needle and thread. He was surprisingly adept at sewing, and it was one of the few times Tommy would fall quiet for longer than a few minutes. Although the Pythia pretended like it was a relief, truthfully, he dreaded those moments of silence. Because if Tommy wasn't talking, that meant the Pythia was left alone with his own thoughts. And that was far worse than just listening to his kidnapper ramble about different types of spiders for 30 minutes straight. Over his first few days of captivity, though, the low buzz of anxiety sitting in the back of the Pythia's head began to fade. Because his time with the deathlings wasn't as much of an unknown. Every time he woke up, he had a rough idea of how his day would go. So his fear diminished, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing. And that was because if he wasn't constantly thinking about how much danger he was in, then he had nothing else to think about. He was bored. Although one wouldn't think that being kidnapped would lead to boredom, the Pythia was quickly finding that was one of the worst parts of the entire deal. Because even though he was surrounded by people, it wasn't like he could just talk with them. They were his kidnappers. And not to mention, they were also batshit heretics who worshipped death herself. They weren't his friends, and he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of thinking they were breaking him down. Because they weren't. Even if he couldn't perform his duties, he was Clara's vessel. That couldn't change, even when he was hidden from her gaze. The deathlings didn't seem to get that, though. Come on, stop being such a piss baby and join in, Tommy teased, waving him over to the center of the room. The Pythia scowled. Why can't you just take me back to my cell? Already told you why I don't want to do that, Tommy reminded him. Well, I'm not joining your stupid game, he huffed, folding his arms over his chest. Beside Tommy, Techno appeared and nudged his shoulder. Just let him hang out there if he wants. We need to pick teams. rolling his eyes, Tommy turned back to the rest of the group, leaving the Pythia sitting against the wall like he had been for the past 5 minutes. Dinner had ended a few minutes ago, but before anyone could filter out of the cafeteria, Phil had appeared in the doorway with an octagonal ball and announced that it was game night. Somehow, everyone except the Pythia seemed to know what this meant, and Tommy had practically dragged him to the main chamber of the temple. Now the Deathlings were chatting eagerly amongst themselves as Phil and Techno prepared to pick their teams. Tommy was bouncing on the heels of his feet, having practically attached himself to Techno's side the moment they entered the main chamber. Tubbo and Amesy seemed to be in a rather intense conversation, with Tubbo trying to punch Amesy in the arm every few minutes, only for them to smack his hand away with a kind of exasperation that told the Pythia they were used to these attacks. Phil was talking to the man with dark green hair the Pythia had seen in the cafeteria on his first day, and now the Pythia could see he also had cybernetic eyes that were entirely black, save for bright green irises that almost matched his hair. Nikki and Romber were laughing about something in the corner, while Jack was talking to someone wearing a red and yellow face mask, repeatedly pointing to the metal panels in his head while the person in the face mask nodded intently. Above it all, the statue of Kristen watched over the group. Her hologram arm flickered slightly, but the faint smile that was hinted at in the corners of her lips never wavered. Suddenly, Phil was calling everyone to attention. "All right, line up." Just like that, all the conversation was cut off. The Deathlings lined up without question, while Phil and Techno stood side by side in front of them, eyes narrowed as the two looked over their options. "So we've decided that since I'm the one who nearly got shot breaking us into the palace the other day," Techno began, folding his arms over his chest, "that I get to pick my first team member." Tommy's eyes were bright as he practically vibrated with excitement, looking like he was just barely holding himself back from raising his hand and shouting, "Pick me! Pick me!" Techno's face was unreadable. His crimson gaze skimmed over the line, hesitating for just a moment on Tommy, before continuing past him to look at the others. The seconds ticked by. Tommy's excitement only grew. "My first pick is..." Techno began, eyes flickering over Tommy again before settling right beside him. "Jack Manifold." Tommy's mouth dropped open, while Jack beamed like he'd just won the lottery. Techno, you're a smart man, let me tell..." "Nah, I'm just messing with you, Tommy. Get over here." Was that on... One second. False alarm, chat. I thought I heard a knock on my door, but I guess it was just something above me, I guess? You hear a lot of weird noises when you live in a college dorm. Surprisingly, I've not heard sex noises yet. Granted, for a good portion of my time here, I didn't have speakers, so I only had headphones. Sorry about that. Where was I? Techno then said. Oh, interrupting Jack. It was still a close enough accent towards him, before he could take even a single step forward. And just like that, Tommy's shock turned to pure joy. "Fuck yeah! Take that, Jack Manor, bitch!" he shouted, punching Jack in the arm before running up to join Techno at the front. Jack stared at the two in pure disbelief, before he let out a loud scoff and flipped Tommy off. "I see how it is, gentlemen. Fine. I'll just have to kick both your asses when we play." He then shot Phil a pleading look. "Phil, come on, man. You've got to choose me now." "Nicky." Phil cut Jack off, something like mirth dancing through his eyes. Nicky looked like she was struggling not to laugh as she patted Jack's shoulder, before making her way to stand next to Phil. Meanwhile, Jack had deflated like a popped balloon, and the Pythia found himself struggling to hide a smile. Techno and Phil continued to switch off picking their team members. Next to join Techno and Tommy's team was Rambu, while Tubbo made his way over to Nicky and Phil. Then Amesy went to Techno, while the green-haired man, who the Pythia learned was named Sam, joined Phil's team. This only left Jack and the person with the red and yellow face mask. Unsurprisingly, Techno chose the non-Jack option, who was apparently named Ponk, which left Jack as the last option to go to Phil, which he definitely didn't seem thrilled about. "You're all fucking pricks," Jack grumbled, as he settled himself in between Nicky and Tubbo. Maybe you should just try actually being good at the game," Tommy shot back. Jack scowled and flipped him off across the room, while Tommy stuck his tongue out at him in retaliation. Techno pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed, while Phil ignored their antics as he moved his team to one side of the chamber. The Pythia watched the team split up into different roles for the game. It seemed that the goals were the archways, the one that led to the hallway where the bedrooms and the bathhouse, and the one that led to the starry room in the hallway to the cafeteria. The goalkeepers were Tubbo for Phil's team and Ponk for Techno's. Phil and Techno met at the center between the two sides of the chamber. They each put a hand on the ball, and after sharing a single nod, tossed it into the air at the same time. As soon as the ball hit the ground, the game was off. Tommy was off like a gunshot. He ran for the ball, kicking it straight towards Phil's goal. Nicky stopped it from getting anywhere near Tubbo, though, kicking it right past Tommy and over to Sam, who started running with it to Techno's goal. Nicky and Sam passed it between each other a few times, before Phil barreled forward with a surprising burst of speed. He angled himself right near Ponk, ready for Sam to pass it to him so he could kick it straight into the goal. But when Sam kicked it towards him, there was a blur of red, and suddenly Amesy was speeding with it straight back to the other side. They passed it to Techno, who sprinted with it down the center of the court towards Tubbo. Tommy was right up beside him, ready to take the shot. The first goal was made by Tommy, with Tubbo's fingers just barely missing the ball as it sailed into the archway. Tommy cheered and Techno high-fived him, and everyone took a moment to catch their breath as Tubbo ran to retrieve the ball. The game continued. Nicky got the next goal, making the points even on both sides. From there, though, Techno's team took the lead, racking up several goals in a row, mostly thanks to Tommy, with a few being the work of Techno as well. As the Pythia watched, though, he couldn't help but notice certain similarities between a few of the players. Amesy, Tubbo, and Rambu all had limps. Amesy seemed to favor their right leg, while Tubbo and Rambu both favored their left. In general, though, Rambu seemed to favor his left side overall, which the Pythia guessed was related to the extensive cybernetics visible on the right half of his body. This also led the Pythia to believe that Amesy and Tubbo probably both had cybernetic legs along with Rambu. They weren't the only ones. Jack struggled with running the most out of anyone. His limp wasn't as obvious as Amesy, Tubbo, or Rambu's, but that was more because it was on both sides rather than him not having one at all. He kept slowing down and tapping his knees with both fists, and the Pythia wondered if both of his legs were prosthetic. Although Tommy didn't have any kind of limp, at one point he'd stopped running in his tracks. He seemed to be gasping for air, hiccuping a few times as he put his hands above his head, like he was fighting to take a deep breath. The Pythia thought back to the other times Tommy's breathing had seemed labored. How every so often he would stop himself mid-sentence to gasp, or how sometimes his breathing hitched without any warning. My breath does that too, the breathing hitching without any warning. Sometimes I'll just take a really deep breath, like sometimes I don't even realize that I'm not really breathing that much, and my body is just trying to catch up with itself. There was something up with Tommy's breathing. That much the Pythia was certain of. Tommy's pause didn't last long, though. He soon was able to take a full breath and flashed Phil a thumbs up, which Phil returned before resuming the game like nothing had happened. Before the Pythia could think much more on that, though, there was a ball flying his way. He shrieked as the ball slammed into the wall right next to his head, hands flying up to protect his face as it fell with a thud, right beside him. There was the sound of footsteps, and he lifted his head to see Phil running to get the ball. Didn't think a football would be enough to take out Clara's chosen, Phil teased, flashing him a sharp grin as the others prepared for the ball to be thrown back in. It startled me, the Pythia snapped, scowling at him. Maybe if you joined in, you'd be less scared of it, Phil pushed, lifting the ball above his head, ready to throw. You sure you don't want to try it out? Gritting his teeth, the Pythia shook his head. Phil snorted. Suit yourself. Then, he chucked the ball back towards the others, and the game resumed as Phil ran into the midst of it again. The Pythia was left on his own, and he tried to slow down the panicked bird in his chest as his heart fluttered rapidly against the bars of his ribcage. Slowly but surely, Phil's team made a comeback. Tubbo and Phil switched roles, so Phil was now the goalkeeper and Tubbo could properly play. Although Tubbo wasn't as fast as Tommy, he was more than willing to go head-to-head with Tommy when he had the ball, and even tackled Tommy to the ground at one point, which was firmly against the rules, according to Techno, even though Tommy didn't seem upset about it in the slightest, if his resounding laugh was anything to judge by. Eventually, the game seemed to slow down as adrenaline waned. There were more pauses as different players had to catch their breath, while others had to shake out their limbs like they'd gone stiff. At a certain point, Amesy announced they needed to sit down for a bit, meaning someone else from Phil's team had to sit out as well to keep things even. Which was how the Pythia ended up with Nikki sitting beside him. Have you ever played football before? Nikki asked as the game resumed. Have you ever played football before? Nikki asked as the game resumed, Tommy laughing when he launched the ball straight into Sam's head. Over here! A high-pitched voice squealed, arms raised as the girl begged him to pass her the ball. Sweat and rain mixed together down the back of his shirt as hot rain poured down from the dark skies above. The air was thick as it slid down his throat, raindrops uncomfortably warm as they slid into his hair like something sticky. He considered passing it to the girl, before looking at the goal only a few extra feet away. The boy guarding it was skinny, and didn't seem like he knew what he was doing. Then again, they all looked that way. Hold on one second. Can you not hear the music? I just realized. Oh my fucking god. 1 second, 1 second. Properties. There we go. That's better. Does that mean... One second. I'm just changing some things up, fixing some things in my thingy. There we go. Sorry about that. Now you should be able to hear the music. I am so sorry. I didn't realize that my input capture wasn't working anymore. If you want to, any VOD watchers, if you want to add your own music, you can. What was that noise? Whatever. Where was I? Then again, they all looked that way. Skinny kids wearing dirty clothes, playing football in the rain because there weren't any adults. God, I sound British. There weren't any adults around to tell them not to. Admittedly, most of the other kids around him had adults who would have told them not to play in the rain if they weren't at work. That was precisely the issue. Most of these kids' guardians were at work. Even if these kids' apartments had leaky roofs and no heating or air conditioning, at least they had somewhere to dry off from the rain. When this game was over, he was just gonna try and hide himself under an awning as best as possible, and hope the rain let up as soon as he knew it, even though he knew it wouldn't. Hurry up and kick it already! The boy standing in front of the goal shouted after another moment. Panic seized him. The boy's scowl was like a slap to the face, and he flinched as he kicked the ball at the girl. It landed in a rancid puddle, splashing dirty water up her leg and making her yelp. But before he could apologize, she was kicking the ball to the goal, the goalie not even getting close to blocking it. She grinned at her victory. He wrapped his arms around himself, wondering if he would have made the goal if he took the shot himself like he wanted to. Not since I was a kid, the Pythia answered after a moment, the stone wall cool against the back of his head. Nikki furrowed her brows. You know, I can't really picture a little kid wearing a blindfold like yours running around the palace playing football. The Pythia snorted at this. It was before I was chosen to be the Pythia, so there was no blindfold, and I wasn't living in the palace. Oh. Nikki blinked, something like understanding washing over her face. For some reason, I thought you grew up in the palace. He shook his head. No. Clara decides when the next Pythia takes over, and usually starts showing the current Pythia visions of the next one a few months before the switch is meant to actually happen. That way they can be found, brought to the palace, and properly trained before receiving their first vision from her. Does that mean the new Pythia doesn't get any warning? They just get told one day, you're going to be the next Pythia, and get taken to the palace? Nikki asked, turning to face him properly. You don't turn down a calling from your goddess, he told her. So you wanted to be the Pythia when you were chosen? Nikki pushed. Rough hands grabbed his arms. Water splashed against his legs as the girl kicked the football his way, only for him to be dragged away before he could kick it back. Panic seized his chest as he begged to be let go, asking over and over again where he was being taken. The Pythia shrugged, ignoring the ache behind his ribs. I'm here, aren't I? Nikki's frown deepened. That's not an answer to my question. No, it wasn't an answer. But if he gave her his answer, she wouldn't understand. Even if she was more understanding than the others, she was still a deathling. She couldn't understand why the sacrifices he made for Clara were necessary. Glancing over at Nikki again, the Pythia noticed she'd pushed her pant legs up so they were bunched up under her knees. It was probably because of how hot it had gotten in the chamber with all the running and sweating going on, because even sitting down, the Pythia was tempted to take his sweater off. But instead of doing that, he found his gaze flickering to the black ink wrapping around Nikki's exposed shin. The tattoo was of a dragon, a large one that started from her calf, twisting around to the front of her shin. Tail looped over itself as the creature bared its teeth in a silent roar. The Pythia noticed how Nikki's metal fingers traced over the design despite the fact that she wasn't looking at it. An old habit, most likely. He thought back to what Nikki and Tommy had told him about the meanings tattoos had for deathlings. Is that a tattoo you got because of a near-death experience? He asked, instead of answering her question. If it is, why a dragon? Because I see that, and I think that there was a fire of some kind. Am I on the right track? Nikki jolted, glancing down at her visible tattoo, before quickly tugging her pant leg back over it. It's a bit personal to ask, don't you think? She said, her voice tight. Turning his gaze back to the game, he relaxed against the stone wall and shrugged. I thought you were fine with asking personal questions, considering the topic of our conversation. The Pythia watched the realization dawn over Nikki's face, her eyes narrowing as heat flooded her cheeks. Fine. Sorry for wanting to get to know you, she huffed, pushing to her feet and leaving him behind. She headed over to her team's goalpost to whisper something in Phil's ear. He nodded and she took his place as goalie, while he walked to the edge of the court to sit out beside Amesy. Despite the fact that he was sitting closest to Nikki's goalpost, she refused to look his way for the rest of the game. Whatever. It was what he wanted, right? Nikki was prying into his past, so he pried into hers to show her how it felt. If strangers were going to pick at his scabs, then he had a right to do the same. The conversation with Nikki had set him on edge. Anger simmered under his skin, It pecked at his ribs as it begged to be let out, only growing worse as the game continued on. The deathlings were having fun. Laughter popped in the air like bubbles, a few high-fives being exchanged after Techno's team scored another point. Their faces were bright red with exertion, but it didn't dampen their smiles. And he wasn't sure why this pissed him off so much, but it did. Because here they were, breathless and happy under the eyes of their goddess. Kristen was smiling down on them. Clara couldn't even see him. Suddenly, there was a surprised shout as the ball bounced his way. It didn't fly by as fast as before, instead rolling to a stop right next to his legs, almost as if the ball itself wanted him to join in. "Hey, Pythia! Toss it to me!" Tommy called out, waving his hands above his head. "No, don't listen to him! Throw it to me!" Jack exclaimed, shoving Tommy out of the way to get a better vantage point. Clenching his jaw, the Pythia pushed off the wall into his feet. He picked up the ball in his hands, running his fingers over the worn-down rubber. The ball was old. That much was obvious. Old and well-loved, with some of the seams having gotten so thin, it would almost be too easy to just pop. The ball deflated as the Pythia slammed his foot down on it as hard as he could. He listened to the air rush out of it, the source of their fun being reduced to little more than a pile of rubber under the heel of his boot. He waited for the rush of satisfaction, for the anger simmering under his skin to die down now that he'd ruined their game. It never came, though. Instead of satisfaction, all he could feel was ice-cold dread as all the deathlings' eyes landed on him at once. At the very least, maybe this would finally make them drop the act. They would realize they weren't going to wear him down by inviting him to join in on their games and getting to know him. That he wasn't going to give them an inch, no matter how much they pushed. The silence dragged on. The Pythia had to fight to keep his chin up, and not shrink back against the wall. Then, "Bruh, you could have just said if you didn't want to pass it back," Techno finally said. That seemed to shatter the tension in the room. Although no one was smiling anymore, quiet conversation echoed off the walls as the deathlings dispersed. Tommy's face was unreadable as he walked over to the Pythia. In a way, that was almost worse than a scowl. At least then he'd know for sure that Tommy was angry at him. But if anything, Tommy just seemed tired. Not necessarily in the physical sense, but in more of an everything sense. He didn't say a word as he bent down in front of the Pythia, picking up the remains of the ball and turning the rubber over in his hands. After a beat, he sighed and let it drop to the ground. Then, he grabbed the Pythia's wrist and led him out of the main chamber and towards his cell. Tommy's middle fingers were cold against his skin, but they didn't hurt. If the Pythia tugged even the smallest bit, he'd be free of Tommy's grip. But he didn't try it. He just let himself be led away, ignoring the weight of everyone's stares as they left the main chamber behind. By the time they reached his cell door, Tommy still hadn't said a word. He unlocked the door, holding it open for the Pythia and dropping his wrist so he could step inside. When he did, he half expected Tommy to follow him, like he was just waiting until they were alone so he could unleash all the frustration brewing behind his eyes. Instead, though, Tommy stayed outside the cell. When the Pythia looked over his shoulder, he saw that there was no frustration sitting behind the blue. Only exhaustion. "Night," Tommy said softly. Then, before the Pythia could respond, the door slammed shut in his face. And just like that, he was alone again. He untied the blindfold, letting it drop to the floor as he took a breath to steady his pounding heart. Pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes, he waited until strange colors began to burst behind his eyelids before dropping onto his mattress, letting out a loud groan. "Clara," he whispered to the empty air. "I don't know what to do. Please, tell me how to serve you from here. Tell me what I should be doing." The silence that wrapped around him was anything but reassuring. His eyes burned with unshed tears. "Let me go back," he pleaded in his head. "I'll do better this time, I swear. Just let me go back to when I knew what I was supposed to do, and I'll prove myself to you. I'll prove myself as many times as it takes." That night was once again marked by no dreams. The next morning, Tommy acted like the incident the day before had never happened. The Pythia wasn't sure if this was relieving or infuriating. On the one hand, he wanted Tommy to say something about it. Even if it was just to call him a dick, at least it'd be an acknowledgement. On the other hand, the cold hand of fear kept gripping the back of his neck every time he wondered what kind of punishment they might give him for that. But considering how Tommy was chatting away like nothing was wrong, he had a feeling he wasn't going to get either of those reactions. No acknowledgement, and no punishment. It was driving him nuts. Did you ever try, those exploding jelly bowl things? Tommy's sudden question startled the Pythia out of his thoughts. "What?" "Those jelly things, the ones that burst in your mouth and you get high," Tommy explained, using his hands to mimic a small explosion as they made their way down the hall. "I always see those ads on billboards for them, but I don't have an ID, so it's not like I can prove I'm 18 to buy them." "Wait, you don't have an ID?" the Pythia asked, frowning at him. "Nope," Tommy quipped. "I'm legally dead." The Pythia blinked. "What the fuck? I'm considered a terrorist. Of course I'm legally dead." Tommy scoffed as if it was something obvious. "Anyway, you didn't answer my question. Did you ever try the jelly balls?" "If you're talking about joy pearls, no, I've never tried them," the Pythia told him, folding his arms over his chest. The light at the end of the hall grew brighter as the cafeteria came into view, illuminating Tommy's face enough to show his exaggerated pout. "So fucking boring," he huffed as they stepped through the archway. The Pythia ignored the insult. There were risks that came with the Pythia using mind-altering substances like joy pearls. Alcohol was fine, and while he'd never had a desire to try it, he was told by a palace physician that marijuana should have been alright as well. But when the reason for his entire existence was to interpret the will of a goddess through visions of the future, the last thing he would want would be to confuse a drug-induced hallucination for a vision. Can't alcohol also give you hallucinations? And weed? Or am I just making that up? I thought I heard it somewhere. Tommy dragged him over to the rug that his friends were already waiting for them at. He deposited the Pythia next to Amesy, which was a slight relief considering he still didn't want to make much conversation with Tubbo, and tried to avoid staring at Rambu for too long if possible. "Morning, guys," Amesy said, waving at both of them as the Pythia settled himself on the rug. "Morning," Tommy replied, turning on his heel again to head to the front of the cafeteria so he could grab both his and the Pythia's food. "Be right back." Now alone with Tommy's friends, the Pythia shrunk back so he was sitting only on the edge of the rug. One of them was going to bring it up. They had to. Neither Tubbo or Rambu had paused their conversation to greet him and Tommy. Their voices were hushed as they spoke in low whispers, Tubbo snickering every few moments, while Rambu looked as if he was trying to hide a grin. It was almost like he wasn't even there. Amesy, meanwhile, was giving him a smile far too bright for this hour of the morning. "Did you sleep well last night, Pythia?" They asked without a single hint of sarcasm in their words. For a moment, the Pythia could only stare. Why would Amesy be asking how he slept? Was that supposed to be a joke? Something referring to last night? If so, it didn't make much sense. Not to mention, the question seemed genuine. So, what did it mean? Fine? He tried. Amesy nodded. "That's good. For some reason my room was so hot last night. It was so hot last night. I think some of the steam from the bathhouse... I think some of the steam from the bathhouse got carried into my room since it's close to it. I don't know, it felt like I was being boiled." They continued to ramble on about their struggle to sleep the night before, but the Pythia tuned it out as he tried to understand what was going on. It was one thing for Tommy, who had to put up with his shit every day, to ignore the incident from the night before, but he at least thought Tubbo would make a comment about it, or Amesy to ask why he did it. His anger from the night before began to simmer once again, bubbling behind his ribs, building up and up as it began to claw at his throat. "Here you go." Tommy's voice cut into his thoughts as a tray of food was shoved in his face. He lurched back, clenching his jaw before taking the offered food. Tommy didn't seem to notice his internal turmoil as he sat down beside him, stretching his legs out in front of him before taking a bite out of a bread roll. His breakfast today seemed to be some kind of soup, light broth with some green vegetables floating inside of it, along with a few pieces of bread on the side. From the corner of his eye, he watched Tommy tear off a piece of bread from his roll and dip it in the soup, humming at the taste as he flashed Amesy a smile. Tommy, has steam from the bathhouse ever gotten into your room before?" Amesy asked as soon as he was settled. "No," Tommy said, shaking his head. "Didn't think it could travel that far away from the river." Amesy furrowed their brows. "I guess that makes sense, but my room is really close to the river, and last night I think some of it got in." "Wait, that's a great idea for a prank," Tommy suddenly cut in, a manic smile spreading over his face. If you could get, some vacuum tubes and hook up the other end to someone's room, you could just fill it with steam and it would be like a sauna." Immediately, Tommy's eyes lit up. "Oh, holy shit, that'd be so funny. Imagine just waking up and you're drenched in sweat." The four began to dive into a discussion about the merits of using steam to prank someone, but the Pythia wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on the soup. His eyes were fixed on the soup while the conversation flowed over his head like boiling water. Aromatic steam curled up from the bowl and around his face, the anger crawling further up his throat. The entire scene was familiar. Tommy, Tubbo, Rambo, and Amesy talking about something silly while he focused on his food. It was what happened nearly every morning since he got here. Nothing changed. No matter what he did, they just didn't care. He pushed to his feet in one smooth motion. His knuckles were white where he was gripping the edges of the tray. Tommy glanced up at him with a frown. You good? Instead of responding, the Pythia tipped his tray over, soup spilling all over the rug as the bowl bounced onto the stone floor. There was a loud thunk as he dropped the tray on top of it, and all at once, the quiet murmur of conversation in the cafeteria fell silent. All eyes were on him. The anger was still simmering, but dropping the soup hadn't done anything to make it go away. He was restless, shifting from foot to foot as his blindfolded gaze met Tommy's, bracing himself for the explosion. There was a moment of silence as Tommy glanced between the spilled soup and the Pythia. "That's a waste of food," he eventually said. The thing was, while there was definitely frustration lining his words, there was no anger. At least, not the kind that was burning the Pythia from the inside out. Once again, there was that strange exhaustion weighing on Tommy's shoulders, and the Pythia shoved away the guilt before it could even properly form. "I wasn't hungry," the Pythia shot back, fighting to keep his voice as emotionless as possible. Tommy looked down at the soup again. "You should clean that up." "Or what?" he challenged, ignoring the stab of fear in his gut. "You'll kill me?" Another beat. Tommy's shoulders slumped. "Fine, go wait by the door while I clean." "I can do it," Imsy quickly said, already getting to their feet. Tommy furrowed his brows. "You sure?" Amesy nodded. "Yeah, don't worry, I'll clean it up." "You should finish your breakfast before you leave," Rambo chimed in. Glancing up at the Pythia again, Tommy shook his head. "I'm not hungry anymore. You guys can have it." Tubbo frowned at this. "Tommy, seriously, it's fine," Tommy said, patting Tubbo's shoulder as he got to his feet. "I'll see you guys later, okay?" Then, ignoring the protests of his friends, Tommy grabbed the Pythia by the wrist and dragged him out of the cafeteria. Again, his grip was loose, almost too loose. It was as if he was taking extra care to avoid any risk of hurting the Pythia, which only made his frustration worse. As soon as they were out of the cafeteria, the Pythia ripped his hand out of Tommy's grip. He expected some kind of protest, or for Tommy to at least shoot him a stern look, but he didn't react. He let his hand drop to his side and kept his eyes straight ahead. The Pythia wrapped his arms around himself, his chest starting to burn with something that definitely wasn't anger. When they reached the starry ceiling, Tommy turned like he was going to take him to Nikki's place like they had been doing the past few days. But instead, he turned to one of the other doors that lined the walls, and knocked on it a few times before stepping back. After a few seconds of waiting, the Pythia heard a muffled voice from inside yell, "I'm working!" "Sam, my hand is on the fritz again," Tommy shouted back. "Can you take a look?" Oh. Sam was the man with the dark green hair from the football game the night before. Tommy had mentioned before that he was the engineer for the Deathling Cybernetics, so he supposed it made sense that Tommy was here if his hand was really acting up. "Alright, come on in," Sam called back. With a loud huff, Tommy pushed open the door, gesturing for the Pythia to follow him inside. The room was perfectly identical to Nikki's in terms of layout. Same stone walls and floor, same arch-shaped wall recesses filled with electric candles, and the same stone bed sitting beside the far left wall. From there, things began to differ, with Sam's desk being much larger than Nikki's, and covered in an array of scrap metal and random wires. Along with that, instead of a wooden cabinet in the back of the room, the entire wall was covered in metal cabinets, different tools and pieces of metal sticking out at random. And then there was Sam himself. He seemed to be using the stone bed as another desk, hunched over with the blowtorch in hand, melting some kind of purple metal together into the shape of a bone? As soon as they entered, though, the torching was cut off. Sam lifted the black visor he was wearing above his head, his black and green eyes fixating right on the Pythia with such intensity it almost made him jolt. "Tommy," Sam greeted, despite not looking at him. "You brought the Pythia here." His voice was tight. Not angry, but not friendly either. It was one of the coldest reactions he'd gotten since arriving here. And strangely enough, that loosened the tight ball in his chest just the tiniest bit. At the same time, though, the fear curling around him grew colder. "Just ignore him," Tommy said, brushing past the Pythia to walk over to Sam. "My hand is being fucking annoying and I need help with it." Although Sam seemed unsure, glancing between the two of them a few times, eventually he sighed and turned to face Tommy fully. "Let me see," he said, his tone far more gentle this time as he held his own hand out. Tommy sighed as he placed his prosthetic hand in Sam's, and Sam peered at it for a few moments before dropping the hand to move his blowtorch setup off the stone bed. He pushed it to one side and gestured for Tommy to sit up there. He hopped up and Sam took his hand again, holding it up to the light to get a better look. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, tapping his fingers one at a time. "You know when I get tired and it gets harder to do, small things with it? Like untying my shoes?" Tommy asked. Nodding, Sam flipped his hand over again, and gestured for Tommy to continue. "It's been doing that more often than usual, and it's still only at night, but it's nearly every night now." "Did you damage it at all when you broke into the palace?" Sam asked, sitting in his own chair again and grabbing a small metal tool from his pocket. The Pythia's jaw clenched when he remembered how cold the metal was against his skin as Tommy dragged him through the dark corridor. He remembered the way the hand had shoved him against the wall, his pearl veil cutting into his cheeks until he tasted blood. He remembered the hand from his vision. intricate carvings sitting beneath that damn deathling mark. Tommy shook his head. No, it was totally fine, but it only started acting up after that night. Furrowing his brows, Sam nodded as he opened up a small panel in the heel of Tommy's hand. A few wires poked out from the panel, and the Pythia watched Sam peer around inside, while Tommy tapped the fingers on his non-prosthetic hand rhythmically against the stone. After a moment, Sam closed the panel. You said it only started after that night at the palace? Tommy nodded, and Sam sighed. Remember what I told you about managing stress? Immediately, Tommy stiffened. I'm not stressed. The Pythia noticed Sam glance at him from the corner of his eye, before focusing back on Tommy. There's no visible damage that I can see. Technically, it could be problems with the nerve connectors. That wouldn't make sense unless you damaged it recently. Scowling, Tommy shook his head. I'm not stressed, though. What do I even have to be stressed about? I don't know. Breaking into the palace and kidnapping the most important person in the entire country might have something to do with it, Sam pointed out in a completely deadpan voice. Tommy huffed, purposefully avoiding looking in the Pythia's direction. He doesn't stress me out, just annoys me. Look, Tommy, Sam began, dropping Tommy's hand again. There's nothing I can do without cutting open your hand to see if the nerve connectors are still in place. If it's not causing you any major problems, then just try to focus on making sure you have plenty of downtime. If nothing improves after a few weeks, we'll consider the nerve connectors again. The Pythia was causing Tommy stress. That should have made him happy, knowing that even if Tommy wasn't showing it, his actions were affecting him, to the point of making his prosthetic malfunction. For some reason, though, this only made the ball in his chest tighten more. Speaking of stress, how are your lungs doing? Sam suddenly asked. Same as always, Tommy groaned, folding his arms over his chest. I still do the weird hitch thing if I talk too fast or get too worked up, but only for a second. The pauses in his breathing, the short gasps he sometimes did without warning. The Pythia had figured out there was something up with Tommy's breathing, and now it seemed he had his answer as to what that was. Cybernetic lungs. Of course. Made perfect sense. Furrowing his brows, Sam turned around and walked over to his desk, rummaging around the scrap metal until he pulled out a handheld scanner of some kind. He made his way back to Tommy, gesturing for him to sit up straighter as he pointed the scanner at his chest. You know how this goes. Breathe in for me. Tommy complied, taking in a deep breath as the scanner lit up. A few seconds passed before the device let out a soft beep, and Tommy immediately exhaled at the sound. Alright, it seems like things aren't getting any worse, so at least there's that, Sam said, peering at the glowing screen on the back of the scanner. Remember what I told you about avoiding things that could overwhelm the system? Yeah, I remember, Tommy grumbled, folding his arms over his chest. It's fucking annoying, but I get it. Good. Like I said, it won't kill you, but Sam, come on, have some faith, eh? Tommy said, cutting him off with a wry grin. I'll be fine. I got the best lungs in town, you know. Built by the best damn cybernetics engineer the world has ever known. Sam rolled his eyes, although the Pythia could see a small smile flicker over his face. I told you, Tommy, this was a rush job done with very limited materials. Your lungs are far from my finest work. And yet I'm still breathing with him after all these years, Tommy pointed out, lightly punching Sam's arm. Though, if you want to prove your skills to me again, I have some ideas. I'm not putting a lighter in your hand. That wry grin disappeared. Why not? Nikki has one. I don't trust you with fire, Sam deadpanned. As Tommy began to splutter out a string of curses and reasons why he could definitely be trusted with fire, the Pythia found himself tuning out of the conversation and shifted his focus onto what he'd just learned. Not only did Tommy have cybernetic lungs, but they weren't perfect. There was a flaw. Although he didn't know exactly what the flaw was, Sam had mentioned that he had to avoid overwhelming the system. And judging by how frequently Tommy's breathing faltered, it seemed as though it wouldn't be hard to trigger that. The fact that Sam and Tommy had discussed this right in front of the Pythia was only further proof of how little they cared about what he did. Tommy didn't see him as a threat. No one in the temple saw him as a threat. He was just there. In a strange way, it was almost familiar, being treated like a decoration. Once again, he was reminded of how this place was still just as much of a cage as the palace had been. Even if his songs were ignored, at least they could be heard. But here in the temple, there were no songs to sing. He was merely there to exist, and nothing more. The songbird could squawk and scream, destroying things and wasting food, but it wasn't going to make a real impact. The deathlings could just ignore the noise, no matter how much of a racket he made. But now a plan was forming in his mind, one that made the wings in his chest flap with panic, but filled him with determination all the same. This bird was going to escape. Whew! Oh man, that was a bit of a shorter chapter in comparison to the other ones. Man, if you thought that was a long chapter, you should have seen the first few. Alright. I think that is going to be my stream. It's getting late. My voice is, my throat is getting sore from all this talking. This was a fun stream though. This was a fun chapter to read. Thank y'all so much for watching. Next stream, don't know when that's gonna be, as finals week is coming closer. And also a big concert with big rehearsals. I don't know how much free time I'm going to have. We'll see. Hopefully it'll be within the next week or so. That's my goal. Alright. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!